The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is known for its colonial history, the Liberty Bell, Independence Hall, and the birthplace of a nation. But beneath the well-trodden paths of Philadelphia and the rolling farmlands of Lancaster County lies something far older, something that whispers of civilizations that vanished before the first European ever set foot on these shores. In the thick forests of the Allegheny Plateau, along the serpentine curves of the Susquehanna River, and atop wind-swept ridges that overlook forgotten valleys, there are secrets carved into stone, secrets buried in the earth, and secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient past of North America. These are not the mysteries of recent centuries. These are enigmas that stretch back thousands of years, perhaps even tens of thousands, into a time when the very landscape of Pennsylvania looked different, when glaciers still clung to the northern reaches and megafauna roamed the forests. Here, archaeologists have found evidence of human presence that rewrites the timeline of the Americas. Here, massive earthworks rise from the ground with no clear explanation of who built them or why. Here, petroglyphs speak in a language no scholar can fully translate, and stone structures align with celestial bodies in ways that suggest a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. This is Pennsylvania's hidden history, a landscape of vanished civilizations, mysterious carvings, and ancient fortifications that defy easy explanation. From the northern border, where a massive earthen mound dominates the horizon, to the southern counties, where stone tunnels wind beneath colonial ruins, the Keystone State holds mysteries that have puzzled researchers for generations. Some of these sites have been studied for decades, others have simply disappeared, swallowed by time and the relentless march of progress. But all of them point to the same unsettling conclusion. We know far less about Pennsylvania's ancient past than we think we do. So wherever you are right now, settled in for the evening, the noise of the day finally fading, make yourself comfortable. We're about to journey through 8 of the most unsolved mysteries of Pennsylvania. 8 windows into a Pennsylvania that existed long before it had a name, long before it was a keystone to anything. This is the story of what we've found, what we've lost, and what still waits to be discovered in the hills and valleys of one of America's oldest states. If you're as fascinated by the mysteries yet unsolved, go ahead and subscribe now to join the journey. And as always, the visuals are here to guide you, but they're not required, so feel free to close your eyes if you like. Just listen and follow along. Let's begin. In the small town of South Waverly, Pennsylvania, just south of the New York border, there rises from the landscape an anomaly that has confounded observers for over 2 centuries. Spanish Hill stands 150 feet above the surrounding terrain, a flat-topped prominence that commands views of the Chemung River Valley in every direction. From its summit, on a clear day, you can see for miles, the perfect vantage point for defense, for ceremony, and for watching the movements of game animals or approaching strangers. But Spanish Hill is not simply a natural formation that ancient peoples chose to occupy. It is something far stranger. The summit of Spanish Hill is surrounded by earthen ramparts and ditches, clear evidence of human engineering on a massive scale. These fortifications encircle the top of the hill in a pattern that speaks of deliberate design and enormous labor investment. The earthworks measure approximately 2,000 feet in circumference, and in some places still rise several feet above the natural ground surface, despite centuries of erosion and agricultural disturbance. When early European settlers first encountered this site in the late 1700s, the fortifications were even more pronounced, and the mystery of their origin was already ancient. The name Spanish Hill itself comes from one of the earliest legends attached to the site, a story that Spanish conquistadors, driven north from their explorations in Mexico and the American Southwest, had constructed a fortress here in the 16th century. The tale claimed that these explorers had carried vast quantities of gold and silver north and buried treasure somewhere on or near the hill before abandoning the site. It was a romantic notion, one that fit the sensibilities of 19th century treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists, but it had virtually no basis in historical fact. No Spanish artifacts have ever been found at the site. No records in Spanish archives mention expeditions this far north into the interior, and the engineering of the earthworks doesn't match Spanish military architecture of that period. As the Spanish theory fell out of favor, other explanations emerged. Some researchers suggested the site had been built by the Susquehannock people, a powerful Iroquoian group that dominated the region during the early colonial period. The Susquehannock were known to construct palisaded villages, and the location of Spanish Hill, near the confluence of important waterways, would have made strategic sense. But the fortifications at Spanish Hill are unlike typical Susquehannock defensive works, and no artifacts definitively linking the site to this culture have been recovered in sufficient quantity to settle the question. Other theories reached further back in time and further afield in geography. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when American archaeology was still in its infancy and plagued by misconceptions about indigenous peoples, some scholars proposed that Spanish Hill was the work of the so-called mound builders, a mysterious race of ancient people who were believed to have constructed the massive earthworks found throughout the Ohio River Valley and the eastern United States. This theory, rooted in racist assumptions that Native Americans were incapable of such sophisticated engineering, has been thoroughly debunked. We now know that the mound-building cultures were the ancestors of historical Native American tribes, not a separate lost race. But the connection to the broader mound-builder tradition raised an important question. Was Spanish Hill part of a larger network of ceremonial or defensive earthworks that once stretched across the Northeast? Archaeological investigations at Spanish Hill have been limited and sporadic. Early excavations in the 1880s and 1890s were conducted with the crude methods of the time, more concerned with finding artifacts for private collections than with understanding the site's context and chronology. These digs turned up stone tools, fragments of pottery, and evidence of fire pits, but little that could definitively date the construction of the earthworks. More recent surveys using non-invasive techniques like ground-penetrating radar have revealed additional features beneath the surface, possible post holes, pits, and structures that suggest the hill was occupied for extended periods, but comprehensive excavation remains elusive. What we do know is this: the effort required to construct the earthworks at Spanish Hill was enormous. Moving thousands of cubic yards of earth without metal tools or draft animals would have required coordinated labor on a scale that suggests either a large organized population or a project of deep ceremonial significance that drew workers from a wide area. The precise astronomical alignments that some researchers have claimed to identify in the layout of the ramparts remain disputed, but the visibility of the site and its commanding position over the valley cannot be coincidental. There is something else about Spanish Hill that doesn't appear in archaeological reports, but is spoken of by those who spend time there. A quality of atmosphere, a weight in the air that seems to press down on visitors. Local historians and paranormal enthusiasts have long claimed the hill is haunted, that strange lights are sometimes seen hovering above the summit at night, and that the wind through the ramparts carries sounds that seem almost like voices. These stories, while impossible to verify, speak to the power that places like Spanish Hill hold in the human imagination. We are drawn to them not just by intellectual curiosity, but by something deeper, something that recognizes in these ancient constructions a connection to people who looked at the same stars, felt the same wind, and wondered about their place in the cosmos. Spanish Hill stands as a sentinel at the northern edge of Pennsylvania, a monument to questions we cannot yet answer. Who built these earthworks? When were they constructed? Were they a fortress against enemies, a ceremonial center for religious rites, an astronomical observatory, or all of these things at different times? The Earth keeps its secrets, and the ramparts that encircle the summit remain as enigmatic today as they were when the first European settlers gazed up at them and wondered at their origin. Before we continue this journey into Pennsylvania's forgotten past, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stood somewhere and felt the weight of history pressing down on you? That sense that others stood in that exact spot centuries before, looking at the same landscape? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. And if you're ready to explore 7 more mysteries that challenge everything we know about ancient America, hit that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning. The story of the Nittany Lion is not like the other mysteries in this account. It leaves no stone ruins, no petroglyphs, and no earthworks that can be measured and mapped. Instead, it exists in the space between history and legend, between the natural world and the spiritual realm. A creature that once prowled the ridges of central Pennsylvania and became something more than flesh and blood, something that transcended its own extinction to become a symbol that endures to this day. The Nittany Valley sits in Center County, surrounded by mountains that rise like the walls of a great natural amphitheater. Nittany Mountain to the south and Bald Eagle Mountain to the north create a landscape of dramatic beauty and ecological richness. It was here, in these forests and along these ridges, that the eastern mountain lion, Puma concolor cougar, once hunted. These were apex predators, solitary and elusive, capable of taking down deer with a single pounce and moving through the forest with such stealth that they were more often heard than seen. The cougars of Pennsylvania were part of a broader population that ranged from Canada to the Carolinas, and they had lived in these mountains for thousands of years, long before they acquired the name Nittany Lion. The name itself comes from the Lenape people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, who called the mountain Nittany, meaning single mountain or mountain alone, referring to its prominence in the landscape. The Lenape knew the mountain lions intimately. They tracked them, respected them, and incorporated them into their spiritual worldview as creatures of power and mystery. In Lenape cosmology, the mountain lion was associated with leadership, courage, and the ability to move between worlds, a creature that existed on the boundary between the human and the wild, the physical and the spiritual. According to one legend preserved in the oral traditions of the region, though its authenticity and specific origins are difficult to verify, there was once a time when the Nittany Valley was terrorized by a massive mountain lion, larger and more ferocious than any other. This creature killed game animals in numbers that threatened the food supply of the Lenape villages, and no hunter could approach close enough to kill it. The lion seemed to possess an uncanny intelligence, evading traps and ambushes with ease. The people lived in fear, and their prayers for deliverance grew desperate. Then, as the story goes, a young Lenape warrior named Malachi fell in love with a princess named Nittany, the daughter of the chief. To prove his worth and win her hand, Malachi vowed to slay the great lion. He prepared himself through fasting and ritual purification, seeking guidance from the spirits. In a vision, he was told to climb to the highest peak of the mountain and wait. Malachi obeyed, and after days of waiting, the great lion appeared. The battle between man and beast was fierce and lasted from dawn until dusk. Finally, with a single arrow guided by spiritual forces, Malachi struck the lion down. But as the creature died, it let out a roar so powerful that it caused the mountain itself to tremble. The lion's spirit, rather than departing to the afterlife, merged with the mountain, becoming its eternal guardian. The people honored this sacrifice by naming the mountain Nittany after the princess. And the mountain lion became a sacred symbol, not of death, but of protection and spiritual power. The physical mountain lions that continued to inhabit the ridges were seen as manifestations or descendants of this guardian spirit, creatures to be respected rather than feared. By the time European settlers arrived in central Pennsylvania in the mid-1700s, the mountain lion population was already under pressure. The settlers, coming from a worldview that saw predators as threats to be eliminated rather than spirits to be honored, began a campaign of systematic extermination. Mountain lions were shot on sight, their dens raided, and their prey animals depleted by overhunting. Bounties were placed on their heads, and within a century, the eastern mountain lion was effectively extinct in Pennsylvania. The last confirmed sighting in the state occurred in 1891 in Berks County, though unverified reports continued sporadically well into the 20th century. But the Nittany lion did not die with the last physical cougar. In 1907, Penn State students adopted the Nittany lion as the university's official mascot, transforming the extinct predator into a symbol of athletic prowess and school pride. The mascot was inspired by Penn State's senior class president, Harrison D. Joe Mason, who coined the name during a baseball game against Princeton. The Nittany lion went from being a flesh-and-blood predator to being a cultural icon, a transformation that echoes the Lenape belief that the lion's spirit had merged with the mountain itself. Today, the Nittany lion exists in a curious liminal space. Biologically, the eastern mountain lion subspecies is considered extinct, though taxonomists now classify all North American cougars as a single subspecies, and there are occasional reports, almost always dismissed by wildlife officials, of mountain lion sightings in Pennsylvania. Some of these are likely misidentifications, perhaps of bobcats or large dogs. Others might be escaped or released captive animals. But some witnesses insist with absolute certainty that they have seen a mountain lion in the Pennsylvania wilderness, and their descriptions are often remarkably consistent with the historical accounts of the eastern cougar. The mystery of the Nittany Lion, then, is not about archaeological evidence or ancient ruins. It is about the process by which a real animal becomes a legend, by which extinction becomes transformation rather than ending. The Lenape saw in the mountain lion a spiritual force that transcended individual animals, and in a strange way, they were right. The Nittany Lion still prowls the ridges of central Pennsylvania, not in flesh but in memory and symbol, in the stories we tell and the meanings we attach to the landscape. There is a deeper question here, one that runs through all of these mysteries. What does it mean for something to be truly gone? The earthworks of Spanish Hill remain even as the people who built them have vanished into time. The Nittany Lion endures as a mascot even as the last eastern mountain lion died over a century ago. We are surrounded by ghosts, by the traces of what was, and these traces shape our present in ways we often fail to recognize. The mountain lion's roar, the story says, caused the mountain itself to tremble. Perhaps it still does, in ways we've learned not to hear. In the rolling farmland of Berks County, not far from the town of Oley, there exists a landscape feature that has sparked debate among archaeologists, astronomers, and amateur researchers for decades. The Oley Hills stone site consists of a complex arrangement of stone walls, cairns, and standing stones spread across several acres of wooded hillside. At first glance, these structures might appear to be the remnants of colonial-era farming, field walls built by Pennsylvania Dutch settlers, clearing land for agriculture. But a closer examination reveals something far more intriguing and far older. The stone walls at Oley Hills are unlike typical agricultural field walls in several key ways. First, they follow no obvious pattern related to property boundaries or livestock management. Instead, they curve and intersect in seemingly deliberate geometric patterns. Second, many of the stones used in the construction are far larger than would be necessary or practical for simple field demarcation. Some boulders weigh several tons and show evidence of being deliberately positioned rather than simply cleared from fields and stacked. Third, interspersed among the walls are cairns, carefully constructed piles of stones, and individual standing stones that have been set upright with clear intentionality. What captured the attention of researchers in the 1980s was the discovery that certain features of the site appear to align with astronomical events. Dr. Salvatore M. Trento, an archaeoastronomer who conducted extensive surveys of the Oley Hills site, documented alignments between standing stones and the positions of sunrise and sunset on the solstices and equinoxes. Other researchers have identified sightlines that correspond to significant lunar positions, including the extreme points of the Moon's 18.6-year cycle, a complex astronomical pattern that requires long-term observation to recognize. If these alignments are intentional, and that remains a point of significant debate, then the Oley Hills site represents a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Creating an accurate solar or lunar calendar in stone requires not just casual observation, but years of careful measurement, mathematical calculation, and engineering skill. It requires a culture that values astronomical knowledge enough to invest enormous labor in creating permanent markers of celestial events. The question of who built these structures and when they were constructed remains deeply controversial. Some researchers argue that the site is evidence of pre-Columbian indigenous engineering, perhaps connected to earlier woodland period cultures that inhabited the region between 1000 BCE and 1000 CE. These cultures are known to have constructed earthen mounds and ceremonial complexes at other sites in Pennsylvania and the broader eastern woodlands. So the idea that they might also have created stone structures is not inherently implausible. However, mainstream archaeologists have been skeptical of claims about the astronomical significance of Oley Hills, pointing out that similar stone walls are common throughout New England and Pennsylvania and are almost always the result of colonial farming practices. They argue that finding astronomical alignments in a complex arrangement of stones is a form of confirmation bias. If you have enough stones and walls, some of them will inevitably align with celestial events simply by chance. Without clear stratigraphic evidence, datable artifacts, or definitive proof of intentional design, they maintain that the most parsimonious explanation is that Oley Hills is simply an unusually complex example of colonial-era agricultural infrastructure. The debate has been further complicated by the involvement of alternative archaeology proponents who see in sites like Oley Hills evidence of ancient transoceanic contact, claims that Celtic, Phoenician, or other Old World cultures visited North America thousands of years before Columbus and left behind megalithic structures. These theories, while popular in certain circles, lack credible archaeological support and often rely on selective interpretation of evidence. What is clear is that proper archaeological investigation of the Oley Hills site has been limited. No comprehensive excavation has been conducted to determine whether there are buried artifacts or features that could definitively date the construction of the stone structures. No detailed analysis of tool marks on the stones has been performed to determine whether they were shaped with indigenous stone tools or colonial-era metal implements. The site exists in a kind of archaeological limbo, acknowledged but not understood, documented but not explained. Walking through the Oley Hills site today is an exercise in ambiguity. The stone walls wind through the forest, half buried under leaf litter and overgrown with moss. The cairns stand silent, their purposes unknown. The standing stones cast shadows that move with the sun, and whether those shadows were meant to mark time or simply fell where they fell is a question each visitor must answer for themselves. There is a human tendency to see pattern and purpose where perhaps none exists, to look at a complex arrangement of stones and imagine ancient astronomers computing the movements of the heavens. But there is also a tendency to dismiss too quickly, to accept the simplest explanation without fully exploring the alternatives. The truth about Oley Hills likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps some elements of the site are indeed colonial field walls, while others represent earlier indigenous construction. Perhaps the astronomical alignments are partly intentional and partly coincidental. Perhaps we are asking the wrong questions entirely, imposing our own categories, ceremonial versus utilitarian, ancient versus colonial, scientific versus spiritual, onto a past that recognized no such distinctions. What Oley Hills reminds us is that the landscape itself is a historical document, and like all documents, it can be difficult to read. The stones are real, the alignments can be measured, but meaning remains elusive. And so the calendar in the woods continues to mark time, if indeed it ever did, waiting for someone to decode its message, or waiting for us to realize that not every mystery has a solution, that some questions are meant to remain open. Here's a question I want you to consider. If you discovered stone structures in the woods near your home that no one could explain, would you assume they're recent farming walls? Or would you wonder if something far older was hidden in plain sight? Let me know in the comments what you'd think. And if these mysteries are pulling you in deeper, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next, because we're about to encounter a discovery that rewrote human history. 50 miles southwest of Pittsburgh, in a sandstone overhang above Cross Creek, there is a place that fundamentally challenged the scientific understanding of when humans first arrived in the Americas. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is not an imposing site. The rock overhang extends only about 50 feet and creates a sheltered space perhaps 30 feet deep. But within the stratified deposits of earth beneath that overhang, archaeologists uncovered evidence that suggested human beings were living in Pennsylvania not 13,000 years ago, as the prevailing Clovis First theory maintained, but potentially 16,000 years ago, or even earlier. The story of Meadowcroft begins in 1973, when Dr. James Adivasio of the University of Pittsburgh began excavations at the site. What his team found over the next several years of careful, meticulous digging was a treasure trove of archaeological evidence spanning millennia. The deposits at Meadowcroft are extraordinarily deep. Over 11 feet of accumulated soil, ash, stone tools, plant remains, and animal bones, laid down layer by layer over thousands of years. Each layer represents a different period of occupation, and crucially, the layers remain distinct and undisturbed, allowing for precise chronological analysis. As Adovasio and his team worked their way down through these layers, they began to encounter artifacts at depths that corresponded to dates far older than the Clovis culture. The Paleo-Indian people, who were, at that time, believed to be the first humans in the Americas, arriving around 13,000 years ago. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from fire pits in the deeper layers returned dates of 14,000, 15,000, and even 16,000 years before present. Stone tools, including small blades and scrapers, were found in clear association with these early dates. The implications were staggering. The Clovis first theory had dominated American archaeology for decades. It is proposed that the first humans entered the Americas by crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia at the end of the last ice age, then spread southward through an ice-free corridor between the massive glaciers that covered much of North America. These people, identified by their distinctive fluted spear points, were thought to have arrived around 13,000 years ago, just as the Ice Age was ending. Meadowcroft suggested that humans had been in Pennsylvania, and by extension the Americas, thousands of years before Clovis, at a time when the glaciers were still at their maximum extent and the supposed ice-free corridor hadn't even opened yet. The archaeology community's response to Meadowcroft was intense and divided. Some researchers embraced the findings as breakthrough evidence that demanded a complete rethinking of migration patterns and settlement chronologies. Others were deeply skeptical, scrutinizing every aspect of the excavation methodology and the dating techniques. The primary criticism centered on the possibility of contamination. Could the radiocarbon dates have been skewed by ancient coal particles in the groundwater, making relatively recent charcoal appear far older than it actually was? Adovasio and his team addressed these concerns through rigorous testing and reanalysis. They conducted multiple rounds of radiocarbon dating, using different sample materials and different laboratories. They analyzed the soil chemistry to determine if coal contamination was present and found no evidence of it. They examined the stratigraphy to ensure that older materials hadn't somehow migrated down into deeper layers. The results consistently supported the original interpretation. Meadowcroft had been occupied by humans at least 14,000 to 16,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. In the decades since the original excavations, additional evidence from other sites across the Americas has gradually vindicated Meadowcroft. Sites in Chile, Texas, Florida, and elsewhere have yielded pre-Clovis dates that are now widely accepted. The Clovis first theory has been abandoned by most archaeologists, replaced by models that allow for earlier and potentially multiple waves of migration. Some researchers now propose that the first Americans may have arrived not through the ice-free corridor, but along the Pacific coast, using boats to navigate south, while the interior was still locked in ice. Others suggest that people may have been in the Americas for 20,000 years or more, though evidence for such early dates remains contested. But Meadowcroft stands apart because of the quality of its excavation and documentation. Modern archaeology students study the Meadowcroft project as an example of proper methodology. The careful stratigraphic excavation, the extensive use of screening to recover even tiny artifacts, the collection of botanical and faunal remains, and the rigorous dating protocols. The site was excavated to the highest standards of its time, and those standards have held up under decades of scrutiny. What makes Meadowcroft particularly poignant is what it tells us about the lives of these early inhabitants. The stone tools recovered from the deeper layers are small and finely made, suggesting a people who were efficient with their raw materials and skilled at working stone. The animal bones include deer, elk, and small mammals, no mammoths or mastodons, which is surprising for a site this old, as these megafauna were still present in North America during this period. Perhaps the inhabitants of Meadowcroft specialized in hunting smaller game, or perhaps the preservation conditions at the site were simply not favorable for larger bones. Plant remains from Meadowcroft include seeds from blackberries, hickory nuts, and hackberries, evidence that the inhabitants supplemented their hunting with gathering of wild plant foods. This speaks to a sophisticated understanding of the seasonal availability of resources and the nutritional value of different plants. These were not simple wanderers, barely surviving on the edge of the glacial wilderness. They were people with knowledge, with culture, and with the skills necessary to thrive in their environment. The climate during the earliest occupation of Meadowcroft would have been markedly different from today. Although the site is south of the maximum extent of the glaciers, the climate would have been colder, with different plant and animal communities. The people who sheltered under that sandstone overhang would have looked out over a landscape of spruce forests and tundra-like openings, where the wind carried the chill of the ice sheets to the north. Yet they persisted, generation after generation, making fires, chipping stone into tools, processing plants and animals, living their lives in ways we can barely imagine. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is now a National Historic Landmark, protected and interpreted for visitors. Standing at the site today, looking up at the rock overhang that provided shelter for so many thousands of years, you can feel the weight of that deep time. 16,000 years, 800 generations, the same stars wheeling overhead, the same creek flowing past, the same stone offering protection from the elements. The people who lived here left behind only fragments, stones, charcoal, and bone. But those fragments are enough to fundamentally alter our understanding of the human story in the Americas. The secret that Meadowcroft held for so long is no longer a secret, but it remains profound. We were here earlier than we thought. We adapted, we survived, we passed knowledge from one generation to the next. The timeline of human history in the Americas has been rewritten because of a sandstone overhang in southwestern Pennsylvania, and with that rewriting comes a humbling recognition. There is still so much we don't know, still so many sites undiscovered, still so many stories waiting to be recovered from the earth. In the 19th century, travelers and settlers in the Monongahela River Valley reported encounters with an extraordinary archaeological site, a massive prehistoric fortification consisting of earthen walls and ditches that enclosed several acres on a prominent bluff overlooking the river. The descriptions were consistent across multiple accounts. Walls 6 to 8 feet high, ditches of corresponding depth, and an enclosure of geometric precision that spoke of sophisticated engineering and coordinated labor. Some accounts mentioned interior structures, mounds, or platforms within the walled area. The site was referred to by various names: the Monongahela Fort, the Moundsville Fortification, the Bluff Enclosure, but it became known in later years simply as the Lost Fort of the Monongahela, because at some point in the late 19th or early 20th century, the site vanished. The earliest descriptions of the fort come from surveys conducted in the 1830s and 1840s, when the Ohio River Valley's prehistoric earthworks were beginning to attract serious attention from antiquarians and early archaeologists. The work of Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis, published in 1848 as Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, cataloged hundreds of mound and earthwork sites across the eastern United States and brought the achievements of North America's mound-building cultures to national attention. In this context, reports of a major fortification in the Monongahela Valley generated considerable interest. According to these early accounts, the Lost Fort was located on a high bluff on the eastern bank of the Monongahela River, somewhere in what is now southwestern Pennsylvania, possibly in Washington or Fayette County. The exact location was never precisely recorded using modern surveying techniques, and the written descriptions, while enthusiastic, lack the specific geographic coordinates that would allow for definitive identification today. This vagueness would prove fatal to the site's preservation. The fort was attributed to the Monongahela culture, a late prehistoric indigenous people who inhabited the region from approximately 1050 to 1635 CE. The Monongahela built villages consisting of round or oval houses, cultivated corn and other crops, and created distinctive pottery decorated with incised geometric designs. They were part of the broader late woodland period cultures of the Northeast, though their exact relationship to historical Native American groups remains unclear. They seem to have abandoned or been displaced from the region sometime in the early 1600s, just before sustained European contact. What made the Lost Fort unusual was its scale and sophistication. While the Monongahela are known to have built palisaded villages, defensive walls made of wooden posts set in the ground, the descriptions of the Lost Fort suggest earthen engineering more characteristic of Hopewell or Mississippian cultures further west. This has led some researchers to speculate that the site might not have been built by the Monongahela at all, but by an earlier culture, or that it represented a unique architectural achievement that pushed the boundaries of what we typically associate with late woodland peoples in the Northeast. The fort's purpose is a matter of speculation. Was it a defensive structure, built to protect against raids from rival groups? Was it a ceremonial center, perhaps used for seasonal gatherings or religious rituals? Was it a combination of both, serving practical and symbolic functions simultaneously? Without excavation and proper documentation, we can only guess. What we do know is that sometime between the 1880s and the 1930s, the lost fort ceased to exist as a visible landscape feature. There are several possible explanations for its disappearance. Industrial development in the Monongahela Valley during this period was intense. Coal mines, steel mills, railroads, and expanding towns all demanded land and resources. Earthen fortifications, no matter how historically significant, were simply obstacles to progress. They were leveled for rail beds, quarried for filled dirt, plowed under for agricultural fields, or built over by industrial facilities. Without legal protection or recognition of their value, prehistoric sites were destroyed by the hundreds across Pennsylvania and the broader Ohio River Valley. It's also possible that the site was never as impressive as the early accounts suggested, that descriptions were embellished, or that what observers interpreted as a carefully constructed fort was actually a natural geological formation with some minor human modification. Memory and legend have a way of enhancing reality, especially when that reality is no longer present to verify. But the most frustrating possibility is that the lost fort still exists, overlooked and unrecognized, hidden in plain sight beneath vegetation, obscured by modern development, or simply never properly connected to the historical descriptions. Without precise location data, archaeologists have no way to conduct targeted surveys. Several sites in the Monongahela Valley have earthworks or landscape modifications that might correspond to the lost fort, but none match the descriptions closely enough to be conclusive. There have been attempts over the years to relocate the fort using historical records, old maps, and surveys of likely locations. These efforts have turned up numerous archaeological sites of interest: late woodland villages, isolated mounds, artifact scatters, but nothing that definitively matches the scale and configuration of the lost fort as described in 19th century accounts. It remains one of Pennsylvania's most tantalizing archaeological mysteries, a site that we know existed but can no longer find. The story of the lost fort is, in many ways, the story of American archaeology itself, a tale of treasures discovered and then carelessly lost, of a nation that destroyed its own heritage in the name of progress before recognizing the value of what it was destroying. By the time historic preservation laws were enacted and public consciousness about archaeological sites developed, countless irreplaceable sites had already been obliterated. The lost fort stands as a memorial to all these vanished places, to the knowledge that was buried beneath parking lots and shopping malls, to the questions that can never be answered because the evidence no longer exists. There is a melancholy to searching for something that might not be findable, to reading descriptions of a place that no observer alive today has ever seen. The people who built the lost fort are gone. The people who first documented it are gone. Perhaps the fort itself is gone, reduced to atoms and scattered beyond recovery. Or perhaps it waits still, silent beneath the Pennsylvania soil, for someone with the right combination of persistence, technology, and luck to bring it back into the light. Until then, it remains what its name suggests: lost. On the banks of the Allegheny River near the town of Franklin in Venango County, there once stood, and in diminished form still stands, one of the most remarkable examples of Native American rock art in Pennsylvania. The Indian God Rock is a massive boulder, approximately 20 feet high and 30 feet wide, covered with 56 petroglyphs carved into its surface. These images depict human figures, animals, geometric shapes, and symbols whose meanings have puzzled researchers since the rock was first documented by European explorers in 1749. The French explorer Céloron de Blainville was among the first Europeans to record the existence of the Indian God Rock during his expedition through the Ohio country in 1749. He noted that the local Native Americans regarded the rock with reverence, and that it appeared to be a site of ceremonial significance. The petroglyphs were already ancient when Celeron saw them, their origins lost even to the indigenous peoples then living in the region. The imagery on Indian god rock is diverse and enigmatic. There are anthropomorphic figures, human-like forms with outstretched arms and legs. There are zoomorphic figures that might represent deer, birds, turtles, or other animals, though the stylization makes precise identification difficult. There are circular shapes that could be solar or lunar symbols, or perhaps representations of shields or faces. There are lines and geometric patterns that might be calendrical markers, maps, or purely decorative elements. And there are symbols that defy easy categorization, spirals, crosses, zigzags, whose purposes we can only guess at. Petroglyph analysis is a challenging field because the symbols themselves offer no straightforward method of interpretation. Unlike hieroglyphics or cuneiform, where we have bilingual texts or extensive contextual clues to aid translation, North American rock art exists in isolation. We don't know what language the creator spoke, what cosmological beliefs informed their symbol system, or what specific events or ideas they were attempting to communicate. We can make comparisons with other petroglyph sites. Look for patterns that might indicate shared cultural traditions, and consult with descendant communities who might retain oral traditions related to the symbols, but ultimately much of the meaning remains speculative. One of the most intriguing aspects of Indian god rock is the question of its age. Petroglyphs are notoriously difficult to date directly because the act of carving into stone doesn't leave organic material that can be radiocarbon dated. Researchers must rely on indirect methods, studying the weathering patterns of the carvings, looking for stratified deposits that cover or underlie the carvings, or identifying stylistic similarities to artifacts from datable archaeological contexts. Based on these approaches, estimates for the age of the Indian god rock petroglyphs have ranged from a few hundred years to several thousand years old. Some of the symbols on the rock resemble motifs found in late woodland period pottery and other artifacts from the region, suggesting creation within the last 1,000 years. Other symbols have been compared to much older archaic period rock art from elsewhere in North America, which could push the date back 3,000 years or more. It's also possible, indeed likely, that the rock was used and modified over a long period of time, with different groups adding their own symbols across centuries or millennia. The rock would have been a landmark in the landscape, a natural monument that drew people to it generation after generation. The spiritual significance of Indian god rock to the indigenous peoples of the region is suggested not just by the petroglyphs themselves, but by the location. The rock sits at a prominent point along the Allegheny River, near areas that would have been rich in fish, game, and plant resources. Rivers were highways in the pre-contact world, essential for transportation, trade, and communication. A large, marked boulder at such a location could have served many functions: a territorial marker, a meeting place, a shrine, a mnemonic device for oral histories, or a message board where travelers left records of their passing. European colonization brought dramatic changes to the Allegheny River Valley. By the early 1800s, the indigenous peoples who had once revered the rock had been displaced or decimated by disease, warfare, and forced removal. The knowledge of the petroglyphs' meanings went with them. The rock, however, remained, now a curiosity to the new inhabitants, rather than a sacred site. In the 20th century, the construction of the Allegheny River Reservoir, as part of flood control and hydroelectric projects, altered the river's hydrology. Indian god rock, which had stood on the riverbank for millennia, now spends much of the year partially or completely submerged beneath the reservoir's waters. This submersion has accelerated the erosion of the carvings. Each time the water level rises and falls, minerals are deposited on the rock surface. Ice forms in the cracks and crevices, causing expansion and fracturing, and the physical structure of the sandstone is weakened. Efforts have been made to document the petroglyphs before they disappear entirely. Archaeologists have created detailed drawings, photographs, and most recently, 3D scans of the rock surface. These digital preservation efforts ensure that even if the physical rock is eventually destroyed by natural or human-caused processes, a record of its appearance will survive. But there is something irreplaceable about the physical presence of the rock itself. The way light falls across the carved lines at different times of day, the texture of the weathered stone, the sense of standing in the same place where, centuries ago, someone carefully pecked these images into the rock face. The Indian god rock reminds us that communication across time is fragile and imperfect. The people who created these petroglyphs were trying to tell us something about themselves, their world, their beliefs, but the message has become garbled in translation. We see the symbols but cannot read them with confidence. We recognize the effort and intention but cannot fully recover the meaning. It's like finding a letter written in a language for which no dictionary exists, a language whose last fluent speakers are long dead. And yet the rock still speaks, even if we struggle to understand. It speaks of human creativity, of the impulse to leave a mark, to say I was here, in a form more lasting than flesh. It speaks of the deep connection between people and landscape, the way certain places accumulate meaning and become sacred. It speaks of continuity and change. The river that flows past the rock has flowed for thousands of years, but the people who walk its banks today are not the same people who carved the petroglyphs, and the meanings we find in the symbols are our meanings, not theirs. The Indian god rock is slowly disappearing, worn away by water and time. Soon, the petroglyphs will be too eroded to see clearly, and eventually the rock itself will break apart and tumble into the river. But for now, when the water level is low, you can still visit the site, still trace your fingers over the ancient carvings, still stand in the presence of this silent witness to centuries of human presence along the Allegheny. And in doing so, you become part of the rock's continuing story, not understanding perhaps, but remembering, which is its own kind of sacred act. The Susquehanna River, one of the great waterways of Pennsylvania, has been a highway for human travel and trade for thousands of years. Along its banks and on islands in its channels, indigenous peoples left markers of their passage, petroglyphs carved into exposed bedrock that tell stories we can no longer fully understand. Among these sites, Chick's Rock stands out both for the quantity and quality of its carvings and for the controversial theories that have grown up around them. Chick's Rock is located in the lower Susquehanna River Valley, in an area that was inhabited by the Susquehannock people during the early colonial period. The Susquehannock were a powerful Iroquoian-speaking group who controlled much of the Susquehanna watershed and engaged in far-ranging trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. They were known to European colonists as fierce warriors and shrewd negotiators, maintaining their independence longer than many neighboring groups before finally being displaced and absorbed by other tribes in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The petroglyphs at Chick's Rock were first systematically documented in the late 19th century by amateur archaeologists and local historians who recognized their significance. The carvings include human figures, some apparently wearing elaborate headdresses or ceremonial regalia. There are animal figures, deer, turtles, snakes, and birds, rendered with varying degrees of naturalism. There are geometric patterns and abstract symbols, including circles, spirals, and lines arranged in configurations that might be decorative, symbolic, or representational. And there are what appear to be footprints, human feet carved into the rock, whose purpose has been much debated. The footprint carvings are particularly intriguing. Some researchers have interpreted them as territorial markers or signatures, individual artists or leaders leaving their personal mark at a significant location. Others have suggested they might be part of creation narratives or origin stories, representing the tracks of culture heroes or spiritual beings who shaped the landscape in mythical times. Still others have proposed more mundane explanations, game tallies, population counts, or simple doodles with no deeper meaning. But it is another set of carvings at Chick's Rock that has generated the most controversy and speculation. Among the petroglyphs are symbols that some researchers have claimed bear striking similarities to ancient writing systems from the Old World, specifically to Phoenician, Libyan, or Ogham script. These claims, if true, would suggest that seafaring peoples from Europe or the Mediterranean visited North America thousands of years before Columbus and left written records of their presence. The idea of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact has long been a subject of debate, ranging from serious academic inquiry to wild speculation. We know with certainty that Norse explorers reached North America around 1000 CE and established a short-lived settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. Beyond this, evidence for other pre-Columbian European or Mediterranean visitors is far more contentious. Archaeological proof of such contact would require finding artifacts or structures that can be definitively traced to Old World origins and dated to pre-Columbian times. So far, no such evidence has been accepted by mainstream archaeology. The claims about Old World scripts at Chicks Rock rest primarily on visual similarities between certain petroglyphs and letters or symbols from ancient alphabets. Proponents point to specific carvings and argue that they match Phoenician letters or Ogham marks with too much precision to be coincidental. They propose that ancient mariners, perhaps driven off course by storms or engaged in deliberate exploration, made their way up the Susquehanna River and left inscriptions recording their journey. Mainstream archaeologists and epigraphers, scholars who study ancient writing systems, have generally rejected these interpretations. They point out that when you have a limited number of simple shapes, lines, circles, crosses, curves, some degree of resemblance between different symbol systems is inevitable and meaningless. They note that the proposed translations of the Chicks Rock inscriptions tend to be inconsistent, with different researchers reading the same symbols as different letters or words. They emphasize that there is no supporting archaeological evidence, no Mediterranean pottery, no Old World metal artifacts, no Old World plant or animal remains, that would corroborate the presence of ancient European or Mediterranean visitors in the Susquehanna Valley. The controversy surrounding Chicks Rock illustrates a broader tension in American archaeology between the desire to find evidence of the extraordinary and the commitment to rigorous scholarly standards. There is something romantic about the idea that ancient civilizations were more connected and adventurous than we typically imagine. That intrepid sailors from the ancient world explored America's rivers and left their marks for us to discover. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the visual similarity of a handful of symbols simply doesn't meet that standard. What is not in question is that the petroglyphs at Chicks Rock are genuine examples of Native American rock art, created by indigenous peoples who had their own rich symbolic traditions, and no need for outside influence to develop sophisticated systems of visual communication. The Susquehannock and their predecessors in the region had been carving images into stone for thousands of years, creating a visual vocabulary that reflected their cosmology, their natural environment, and their social structures. Like Indian God Rock on the Allegheny, Chicks Rock faces threats from modern development and environmental change. Changes in river flow due to dam construction, increased boat traffic, and deliberate vandalism have all taken their toll on the petroglyphs. Some carvings that were well preserved in the 19th century are now badly eroded or defaced. Others have been lost entirely as sections of rock have broken away or been submerged by changing water levels. Documentation of the site has improved in recent decades, with detailed photographic records and 3D scanning helping to preserve a digital record of the carvings. But as with all rock art, there is no substitute for the original, the physical object in its landscape context, weathered by time but still present, still connecting us to the hands that carved it. The debate over the meaning of Chicks Rock's petroglyphs, whether they are purely indigenous creations or evidence of ancient transoceanic contact, is unlikely to be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What we can say with confidence is that the Susquehanna River Valley has been a place of human activity for millennia, that the peoples who lived here developed complex cultural traditions, including visual art and symbol systems, and that they left behind messages in stone that continue to provoke wonder, speculation, and disagreement. In the end, perhaps the greatest message of Chicks Rock is not in any specific interpretation of individual symbols, but in the simple fact of the carving's existence. Someone cared enough about this place, about these images, about communicating across time, to spend hours laboriously pecking away at hard stone with primitive tools. That act of creation, regardless of what specific meaning the creator intended, speaks to something fundamental about being human, the drive to make marks, to say something that will outlast our brief lives, to reach across the centuries to unknown future viewers and say, in the only way available, remember us, we were here. In Lebanon County, near the town of Cornwall, stands a massive stone structure that is both a monument to Pennsylvania's industrial past and the gateway to a far older mystery. The Cornwall iron furnace is a remarkably well-preserved 19th century blast furnace, one of the finest examples of industrial architecture from America's early iron-making era. Built in 1857, it operated until 1883, producing iron that was used in everything from cast iron stoves to cannons for the Union Army during the Civil War. The furnace is now a state historic site, carefully maintained and interpreted for visitors who come to learn about the Industrial Revolution that transformed Pennsylvania into one of the nation's manufacturing powerhouses. But beneath the furnace, extending deep into the hillside, there are tunnels that tell a different story, a story that predates the industrial age and reaches back into Pennsylvania's mysterious prehistoric past. The tunnels beneath Cornwall were discovered during the mining operations that supplied ore to the iron furnace. As miners dug deeper into the iron-rich deposits, they began to encounter passages that clearly had not been created by their own work or by previous colonial-era mining efforts. These were not the clean-cut, timber-supported tunnels typical of 19th century mining. They were irregular stone corridors, following natural fissures in the rock, but showing signs of human modification. Walls that had been smoothed, rubble that had been deliberately cleared, and in some cases, tool marks that suggested the passages had been widened or shaped by hand. The discovery sparked immediate speculation. Who had created these tunnels? When? And most importantly, why? The most prosaic explanation was that they were simply natural caverns or fissures that had been minimally modified, perhaps used for shelter or storage by indigenous peoples at some point in the distant past. But as exploration of the tunnels continued, other details emerged that complicated this simple interpretation. In some sections of the tunnels, miners reported finding what appeared to be ancient mining debris, broken stone tools, charcoal from old fires, and residues that might have been from ore processing. If these observations were accurate, and records from the time are fragmentary and often secondhand, they would suggest that someone had been mining iron ore at Cornwall long before the arrival of European settlers. But for what purpose? Pre-Columbian indigenous peoples in Pennsylvania did use native copper and occasionally other metals for tools and ornaments. But ironworking requires high-temperature furnaces and relatively sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. There is no established evidence that pre-Columbian cultures in eastern North America smelted iron. This incongruity led to more elaborate theories. Some proposed that the tunnels were spirit mines, sacred spaces created by indigenous peoples for ceremonial purposes rather than for extracting ore. In this interpretation, the passages would have been places of vision quests, initiation rites, or communication with the underworld. The darkness, the confinement, the separation from the surface world, these are elements found in many indigenous ceremonial traditions related to death, rebirth, and transformation. Others suggested that the tunnels might be connected to the mysterious Allegheny mounds and other prehistoric earthworks scattered across Pennsylvania. Perhaps the tunnels served as sources of specific types of earth or stone used in mound construction. Perhaps they were part of a larger ceremonial landscape, connecting underground spaces with above-ground monuments in ways that reflected cosmological beliefs about the relationship between the Earth's surface and what lies beneath. The most fringe theories, predictably, invoked ancient visitors from other continents. Phoenician miners seeking copper or iron, Celtic explorers following underground veins of ore, even pre-Columbian Welshmen, whose presence in the Americas is a persistent legend, unsupported by credible evidence. These theories suffer from the same problems as the claims about Chicks Rock: no confirmatory artifacts, no contextual support, and explanations that rely on assuming what they're trying to prove. What makes the Cornwall tunnels particularly frustrating from a research perspective is that they are largely inaccessible today. For safety reasons, most of the underground passages have been sealed or are restricted to areas where proper support structures have been installed. The State Historic Site focuses on the iron furnace itself, and the tunnels, while acknowledged, are not open for public exploration or systematic archaeological study. This means that many of the questions about their origin, age, and purpose remain unanswered and may remain unanswerable unless future archaeological work is undertaken. What we can say is that humans have been drawn to this location for a very long time, attracted by the same iron-rich deposits that would later make Cornwall a major industrial site. Whether prehistoric peoples mined these deposits, used the natural caverns for shelter or ceremony, or simply explored the underground spaces out of curiosity, we cannot definitively determine without proper excavation and analysis. The image of the labyrinth beneath the furnace serves as a fitting conclusion to this journey through Pennsylvania's unsolved mysteries. It reminds us that history is layered, that the past does not exist in discrete, separable periods, but rather accumulates, one era built upon the ruins of another. The iron furnace stands as a testament to 19th century industry, but it rests on ground that was significant to earlier peoples for reasons we may never fully understand. The tunnels wind through stone that was formed hundreds of millions of years ago, modified perhaps thousands of years ago, and explored by miners barely a century ago. Each layer of time leaves its mark, and we are left to interpret those marks with the imperfect tools of archaeology, history, and imagination. Cornwall asks us to consider what lies beneath our feet, beneath our recorded history, beneath the assumptions we make about who was here and what they knew and what they were capable of. It suggests that Pennsylvania's landscape, seemingly so familiar and well documented, still holds secrets in its dark places, secrets that might never be brought fully into the light. Pennsylvania's unsolved mysteries do not offer easy answers. They resist neat conclusions and definitive interpretations. What they offer instead is something perhaps more valuable, a reminder of how much we don't know, how fragile our understanding of the past really is, and how much knowledge has been lost. Not just through the inevitable erosion of time, but through the active destruction wrought by our own species. The earthworks of Spanish Hill still stand, but we cannot say with certainty who built them or when. The Nittany Lion prowls in memory and symbol, but its flesh and blood form is extinct from Pennsylvania's ridges. The stone alignments of Oley hills may encode astronomical knowledge, or may simply be farm walls, and we lack the definitive evidence to choose between these interpretations. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter has rewritten the timeline of human arrival in the Americas, yet even with its wealth of data, enormous questions about the earliest Americans remain unanswered. The lost fort of the Monongahela has vanished so completely that we cannot even locate where it once stood. The Indian God Rock slowly disappears beneath the waters of the Allegheny Reservoir, its messages eroding before we have fully learned to read them. Chicks Rock's petroglyphs spark debates about ancient visitors that probably say more about our desires and assumptions than about the actual past. And the Cornwall tunnels remain sealed, their secrets locked underground, accessible only to speculation and memory. These mysteries share a common thread. They represent moments when the past breaks through into the present, when we encounter something that cannot be easily explained away or dismissed, something that demands we reconsider what we think we know. They are cracks in the comfortable narrative of history, suggestions that the story is more complex, more ambiguous, and more interesting than we typically acknowledge. They also share another quality: fragility. Every one of these sites is threatened by natural erosion, by development, by vandalism, by simple neglect. Once destroyed, archaeological sites cannot be recreated. Once eroded, petroglyphs cannot be recarved. Once lost, the knowledge they contained is gone forever. We are the custodians of these places, whether we choose to accept that responsibility or not, and how we treat them will determine what future generations can learn from them. The deeper mystery beneath all these specific mysteries might be this: why does the past matter? Why should we care about earthworks built by unnamed peoples, about extinct mountain lions, about stone structures and rock carvings whose meanings elude us? Perhaps because these fragments of the past remind us that we are part of a story far larger and longer than our individual lives, that others have stood where we stand and wondered about the same questions. Where did we come from? What does it mean to be human? How should we live? And perhaps because in protecting and studying these remnants, we are engaging in an active conversation across time, speaking to those who came before and those who will come after, affirming that their lives mattered, that their works deserve remembrance, that the long story of human presence in this landscape continues. Pennsylvania's unsolved mysteries will likely remain unsolved, at least in their particulars. We may never know who carved the first petroglyph at Indian God Rock, or what they meant by it. We may never relocate the lost fort, or understand the full purpose of Spanish Hill's earthworks. But the mysteries themselves, the questions they pose, the wonder they inspire, the humility they demand, these are gifts that continue to enrich us. They keep us curious, keep us questioning, keep us looking at the familiar landscape around us and seeing the strange and the ancient that lies just beneath the surface. The wind still moves through Pennsylvania's forests, carrying the same sound it carried when the first humans walked these hills. The rivers still flow over bedrock carved with ancient symbols. The earth still holds within it the tools and the bones and the charcoal of countless fires, evidence of lives lived in ways we can barely imagine. And somewhere in the dark places, in the sealed tunnels and the unexplored caves and the deep stratigraphic layers yet to be excavated, there are secrets still waiting for someone with the patience to search, the skill to interpret, and the wisdom to understand that some answers only lead to deeper questions. This is Pennsylvania's hidden history, not a single story, but a palimpsest, layer upon layer of human presence, each generation leaving its mark, each mystery adding to the accumulation of wonder. And we, standing here in our own moment, looking back at what remains and forward to what might yet be discovered, are simply the latest witnesses to a story that is far from finished. So here's my final question for you. Which of these 8 mysteries do you think is most likely to be solved in our lifetime? Spanish Hill's builders? The location of the lost fort? The meaning of the petroglyphs? Or something else entirely? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious what you think. And if this journey through Pennsylvania's hidden history moved you, if it made you see the landscape differently, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who loves a good mystery. Because these stories deserve to be remembered.